UFOs have been on the news for several months now, and they're getting some serious attention in government circles. Even former President Barak Obama commented on it, saying, "I'm actually being serious here. There's footage and records of objects in the skies that we don't know exactly what they are." Did you know that in scientific communities, of all places, there has been resistance to and pushback against the research and exploration of UFOs? Hey there, news peelers. Today is July 9, 2021, and this is Adele with the Peel.News. Once a week, we select a news item and peel the history behind it to gain perspective from the past. And oh boy, sometimes history gives us a good laugh. Sometimes it offends. And sometimes it just shocks. Like, did that really happen? I'm telling you, you can't make up some of this stuff that happened in our past. So grab a cup of coffee or your favorite drink or both, and let's get into it. By now, most of you have seen the US Navy's videos of UFOs. If not on your TV screens, most definitely on social media. The Pentagon unclassified and recently released those videos, which by the way had been leaked to the public years before anyway. But the Pentagon has done more than just that. Last year, it revived the Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force to examine these flying objects. And on June 25th, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released its long-awaited UFO report. That report identified unexplainable cases of flying objects that, according to Navy pilots, move at 5 times the speed of sound, and submerged and changed directions and accelerated in such ways that are beyond the known capabilities of the United States and other nations' technologies, including Russia's and China's. So while the report found no evidence of alien technology in these unexplained flying objects, it couldn't rule them out either. To better understand what the scientific community thinks of UFOs and to what extent they actually research this fascinating and mysterious subject, we spoke with Mr. Avi Loeb, a professor and the former chair of the Department of Astronomy at Harvard University. He's the founding director of Harvard's Black Hole Initiative and a former member of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology at the White House. Professor Loeb has authored 4 books and some 700 research articles. His latest book is Extraterrestrial: The First Sign of Intelligent Life Beyond Earth. It was published in January of this year. Links to his academic homepage as well as his recent book are provided in the detailed caption of this episode, which was recorded before the government's release of its UFO report. So stay with me as Professor Loeb and I peel the history behind this news.
This podcast is available on all your favorite podcast platforms, including Spotify, Google, and Apple. And if you're listening to us on Apple, please write us a review. And don't keep it to yourself. Tell a friend about the Peel.News podcast.
Professor Loeb, it is such a pleasure to have you on our show today. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. So UFOs have been on the news, and by news, I don't mean cable channels or journals that specialize in UFO and astronomy or other such specific specialized subjects. By news, I mean mainstream news, like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, CNN, Fox News, and what have you. Navy pilots are saying that they've seen objects do maneuvers that would be impossible to do with known technology, human technology. Does that make them UFOs? I guess, Professor Loeb, the question that I'm asking is this: what are UFOs? And I guess recently they're calling them UAPs. Yeah, let's start with the basics.
Yeah, so I should clarify that any mundane explanation to some objects is not of interest here in this discussion. What we are really trying to find is potentially objects that are behaving in ways that cannot be explained by our technologies and cannot be explained by natural phenomena. That's what we're seeking.
Exactly.
And when you say unidentified objects more generally, that could be a mixed bag because, you know, for some people on the street that look at the sky, they may see every now and then an object that they cannot explain, but it may be of military origin, you know, that the government is using some equipment that we are not aware of. It may be some illusion, optical illusion. So when you talk about unidentified objects, it's a mixed bag, and we shouldn't really assume that, let's say, the government decides that one particular object looks really unusual, that it makes all the previous reports on UFOs valid, because it may well be that most of the previous reports that people had had completely mundane explanations. It's just that the one event that the government identified looks really weird because we have detected it in multiple. Yeah. With multiple cameras, with multiple people, and so forth. So I just want to clarify that.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. But the reason we care about them is because of the potential implication that they might signal another civilization out there that sent equipment that is visiting Earth. And of course, I think, you know, at first, when the government detects objects that cannot be explained, the immediate concern is of national security, and that's why,
of course,
many of these objects were classified. And the first thing you want to find out is whether they were manufactured by another nation, but they are human-made, and
like Russia or China or something like that.
Yeah, Russia or China are spying on the U.S. and of course, if it were the case, well, first you need to convince yourself that these are real objects and not a smudge on the camera and not an illusion. And the way to figure this out is by detecting an object with multiple instruments, such that the malfunction of one of them will not lead you to identify this a real object. And if you have multiple objects like infrared detector, multiple instruments like infrared detectors, optical cameras and multiple people and radars seeing the same object moving in the same way, then it lends credibility to the fact that the object is real. And I think one of the statements that were leaked already from the forthcoming Pentagon report is that some of the objects appear to be real based on multiple detections. And that is, I think, an extremely important statement, because if these are real objects, the government will never report about seeing them if it's suspected that they belong to another nation, because then, as a matter of national security, you would like to respond properly to these objects if you know that
instead of immediately disclosing it.
Yeah, they are human-made, and like any other issue of that is of national security, most of the time you don't want to speak about it publicly and just solve the problem. So the fact that there will be a public report talking about real objects is very significant, because it would mean if some of the objects, again, I have to reiterate that it may not imply anything about this mixed bag of many other reports that appeared in the past, but if some of the objects appear to be real and appear not to be human-made, then there are two possibilities left on the table. One is that they are natural, some phenomenon that we have not yet figured out creates such things, and they behave in ways that have nothing to do with our technologies. Okay, that's one possibility. And a second is that they are equipment from an extraterrestrial civilization. And in order to figure out the correct interpretation, we need to collect data, and this subject should move away from the talking points of politicians or national security advisor and military personnel to be to the realm of science, where scientists will collect data using state-of-the-art cameras that are not classified. One reason the data was classified is it was assembled by sensors that are classified, and you don't want to reveal the US capabilities in terms of its defense system and the sensors that are monitoring the sky all the time. So that's why the data was classified. But if there is a bunch of scientists placing cameras that can be bought in stores, at the same locations, and collecting data and looking for unusual phenomena, that data will be open and will be open to the public, and can follow the standard scientific practice where you know what the data is, then you analyze it in an open way, and we can clear up the fog. I think that the most dangerous or inappropriate, unhealthy situation is if, on the one hand, there is the report that some objects are real and not fully understood, and then at the same time, the science community ridicules any extraterrestrial association and just says there is no point in checking. And
Professor Loeb, if I may, please, you bring up a very important point that's really dear to my heart. I've been following this for some time. You mentioned science, scientific communities, scientific research. This is what I want to learn from you. Is there some resistance in the science of astronomy or community of professional astronomers that is resisting the study and research of UFOs? Are you getting backlash?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, definitely there is a lot of resistance and pushback.
Why?
And I should emphasize, the strange thing is that one of the strongest voices against discussing this are people engaged in SETI, in the search for extraterrestrial. If you look at people representing the SETI Institute are talking against any association of these objects with an extraterrestrial. And
would you tell me what the SETI is, please?
SETI is abbreviation for the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and traditionally,
and they're the ones who are resisting this research.
This discussion, yes. You can find some of the people representing, and there are at least 3 of them that were very vocal over the past few months. And they all, I wrote a book about a completely separate object that was discovered in 2017 that by astronomers that behaved very differently from any comet or asteroid that we have seen. And I just suggested that we consider the possibility that it's artificial in origin. And those 3 representatives of the SETI community were very negative and pushing back quite aggressively against that interpretation. They applied.
Is there a reason for that?
Yeah, well, so a lot of people are looking around at other people, and basically instead of keeping their eyes on the ball, they keep their eyes on the audience, and they want to be liked on Twitter. And there is a taboo on discussing this subject. It's because it was in the past a subject of science fiction that did not necessarily follow the laws of physics, and because it was very popular in the public, a lot of scientists prefer to keep a distance from it so that they will not risk their image or reputation. But the point is, if there are facts that are intriguing, we should explore. We should try to get more evidence, more data, and clear up the nature of the objects that we see, because otherwise, if you close off the windows, if you close off the shutters and say, we don't have neighbors, I just need extraordinary evidence in order to even consider that in my vocabulary, then guess what? I mean, the fact that you're not looking out the window will not change whether you have neighbors or not. They are either out there or not. And the only way to find out is by seeking evidence without prejudice, without the preconceptions.
Speaking of seeking evidence, is there funding for that research in the scientific community?
Not really, because of this intellectual climate that makes it a taboo, and that's unfortunate. Because if you think about
It is unfortunate.
if there is, for example, most of the matter in the universe is of a nature that is not understood. It's called dark matter. We don't know what it's made of, what kind of particles are making the dark matter. It's 5 times more abundant than ordinary matter in the mass budget of the universe. And we don't know what it is. We're completely, we're searching in the dark, so to speak. And nevertheless, hundreds of millions of dollars were allocated to the search for specific types of dark matter. That's considered part of the mainstream. That is very much a subject for which people that do not find anything are getting rewarded for not finding things that were suggested by other scientists. And you ask yourself,
wait, I didn't understand that, sir. You said they're not finding anything and they're not getting rewarded. Did I paraphrase?
They are getting rewarded for placing limits on suggestions that were made by others. And all of these suggestions should be regarded as speculative at this point, since no evidence was found. For example, in the context of the search for weakly interacting massive particles, that was extremely popular when I was a postdoctoral fellow, and that was the sort of most popular version of dark matter at the time. And a lot of experiments were designed to discover the dark matter, and people were forecasting that within a few years, maybe a decade, they will find it. And then nothing was found for several decades now. Nevertheless, this is a mainstream activity, still funded, and for which, if you place limits, if you restrict some of the parameter space for these particles that are completely hypothetical, you get rewarded scientifically in the mainstream. You get prizes, you get into honorary societies.
That doesn't sound scientific at all. That kills curiosity, doesn't it?
Well, so the point is, I'm saying, here is an example for a speculation, which is completely in the dark. We don't know what the dark matter is, and we are still investing huge sums of money, and people are getting a pat on their back for actually ruling out suggestions by others. Whereas we know that we exist, right? We know that we are a technological civilization. We know that about half of the sun-like stars have a planet the size of the Earth, roughly at the same separation. So in fact, what we see in our backyard, the Earth-Sun system, is not unusual in any way. It's not privileged. And so what's more natural than to say, under similar circumstances, you might get similar outcomes. And therefore, there should be many more technological civilizations out there just like us. And in fact, most of the stars formed before the sun, billions of years before the sun. So you would expect there to be a lot of technological civilizations that sent out equipment into space billions of years ago.
Just as we are doing now, right?
As we are doing now. So my point is rather simple. My point is, it's not completely, we're not searching completely in the dark, because we know that we exist. We know that many other planets are similar to Earth. So let's just check if there is equipment floating in space that was sent in our direction. And it's a matter of checking, an experimental search. And why would that not be funded? Why is that 1,000 times less funded than the search for dark matter?
1,000 times, wow.
Yeah, 1,000 times. And there are maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars allocated for this search compared to hundreds of millions from federal sources.
And Professor Loeb, speaking of, I apologize for interrupting you. Speaking of equipment sent out by other civilizations, potentially, you're gonna have to help me with this pronunciation. You've referred to this object several times in your writings. Oumuamua, am I saying that correctly?
Oumuamua, yes.
Thank you. Which was, and I'm quoting from you, sir, was classified as a rock, but looked nothing like a rock, or asteroids or comets.
Right.
So is that an example of an enigma that has not been solved, or what's the situation with that?
Yeah, so this is an object that I discuss in my recent book, Extraterrestrial, that appeared a few months ago. And I described the fact that it was very weird, unlike any rock that we have seen before in the solar system. And it was the first object detected from outside was situated in Hawaii. And at first, astronomers thought maybe it's an asteroid, maybe it's a comet, but it didn't have any cometary tail. There was no dust or gas around it. And as it was tumbling every 8 hours, the amount of light that it reflected changed by a factor of 10. And that implied a very extreme shape, most likely pancake-like or flat shape. And then it was pushed away from the sun by some force that is in addition to the force of gravity acting on it. And it was not clear what could give it the push, given that there is no evaporation of gas out of it, as in the case of a comet. It needed, about 1/10 of the mass of this object needed to evaporate in order to give it enough push. So we didn't see that. And the only explanation I could think of is the reflection of sunlight is pushing it. And for that to be effective, the object had to be very thin. And I suggested that it's artificial in origin because nature doesn't make very thin objects the size of a football field, less than a millimeter in thickness. And
we're talking about a piece of paper. I mean, a very long
it's
piece
just
of paper.
just like a piece of paper. And then there was another object discovered that exhibited an excess push from the sun without a cometary tail. It was discovered in September 2020. It was given the name 2020 SO. And then it was discovered on the same telescope. And the astronomers that discovered it then realized, it actually came from Earth. It was a rocket booster from a 1966 launch that was discovered, and it had very thin walls. That's why it exhibited the push. So in that case, we know we produced it artificially. In the case of Oumuamua, we don't know who produced it. And if you ask, why would it be thin? Of course, it could be a light sail, which is pushed by light. But I think another possibility is that it serves as a receiver for signals, that maybe it's like a dish that receives signals. And if the UAP or UFO phenomena is real, it could be that there are some probes already on Earth that were sprinkled long ago, and this object just came by to collect the data and from them. And of course, another possibility is that this very thin and the size of a football field kind of structure was used to collect sunlight in order to power whatever is on board. That's another possible use of it.
Interesting.
Go ahead.
Professor Loeb, why has the abbreviation UAP, first of all, what does this stand for? And why is that gaining more currency than UFO? Is that a preferred abbreviation term?
No, I think it's just because of the baggage that comes with the term UFO and the fact that there is a taboo in the scientific community on discussing it, ridicule. So I think the government just wanted to use a different term so that they when they discuss it, it appears as if it's different. And as I mentioned before, indeed, it could be that whatever is put under the label of UFO, it's a mixed bag. There are most of the things are due to mundane explanations, they have nothing to do with extraterrestrials. But whatever the government identified that was detected by multiple instruments, multiple pilots, multiple military personnel, Navy ships and so forth, whatever that is different, and so it really depends on the details. The truth is in the details of each object on its own,
which needs to be researched.
Which needs to be, exactly. It needs to be addressed by this, because if we leave the situation as is, where the public speculates, it's unhealthy. And I think the scientific community can clear up the fog if we just do an experiment. It will not be very expensive, it's just, and I'm happy to lead such an expedition.
Wonderful. Why don't we take a short break and talk about UFOs and us, humans?
This episode is brought to you by Anchor.fm. Download the free Anchor app or go to Anchor.fm to start your own podcast. It's easy. Anchor is free, and it's got everything for you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and other platforms, And there is no minimum audience requirement to monetize your podcast. People want to hear your story, your opinion, so share it with them through your own Anchor podcast.
Professor Loeb, here's a question that, well, it may seem silly to ordinary people, but not to me because I'm interested in this and I've invited you here, and it's probably certainly not to you. Why are humans so fascinated with UFOs or UAPs, whatever you wish to call it? Well, when you see it on TV, you just sort of gravitate towards it. Why?
Well, because it's an opportunity for us to learn something. It's when my daughters went to the kindergarten, on the first day, they were shocked because they thought that they were the smartest in the world, and then they found other kids that may be smarter than them. And
that is so hilarious.
The fundamental question is, are we the smartest kid on the block? And if not, we can learn from a smarter kid. And why would the kid be smarter than us? Well, it could be that the kid was born that way, or simply that this other civilization had more time to develop their science and technology. We just did it over the past century, but our technologies are evolving exponentially on a few-year timescale. So just imagine what we will have in 1,000 years or in 1,000,000 years. It will be unrecognizable. It would look like magic to us today. And another civilization.
I'm sure cell phone will look like magic to people that lived in the 1890s, right?
Or to a caveman. A caveman seeing a cell phone would think that it's a shiny rock. My point is that a very advanced technology may look like magic, may be an approximation for God, as far as we are concerned, because it will do miracles. It would do things that we don't imagine. Obviously, it could potentially create life. We are trying to do that in our laboratory.
Actually, now that you say that, magic, look, approximation to God, and this is not our topic, but there is a show called Ancient Aliens that they really make a big deal of this, how Asian people may have thought of aliens as gods or something like that. I understand that we're not talking about this, but it sort of goes along parallel to what you're saying, sort of our fascination.
Yeah, I mean, some of these ideas were thought obviously many years ago, but the point is, modern science is all about evidence. So the fact that people imagine things, they imagined a lot of wrong things as well, and the fact that they imagined this something doesn't mean that it carries water. That it can actually be used as a proof to anything. The beauty of modern science is that we have the instruments that can collect evidence and guide us as to what reality is like. So if we get photographs, if we get more data on objects that behave in ways that we cannot explain, then at some point, we will figure out whether there is any equipment that could have arrived from another place. And this is evidence-based. It's not conviction-based. It's not a matter of belief. It's not a philosophical argument. Like, for example, in the context of Oumuamua that we discussed before, this, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. In my case, a picture is worth 66,000 words, the number of words in my book, Extraterrestrial. I wouldn't need to write the book if we had a photograph. And we can get a photograph of a future object that will be found in the coming years. If it behaves the way that Oumuamua did, doesn't show a cometary tail and getting pushed by reflecting sunlight, we can send a spacecraft. If we get an advance warning of it coming towards us, we can send a spacecraft equipped with a camera that will intercept its trajectory and take a close-up photograph and potentially even land on it, just like OSIRIS-REx landed on the asteroid Bennu.
My goodness. So what if you're talking about this extraterrestrial equipment arriving, coming towards us, and somehow we intercept it? I mean, the follow-up question is natural. What if UFOs do show up here?
Yeah, so the point is, I don't think anyone would argue with a photograph. because if you do the experiment scientifically, there is no way that the photograph can be doctored. When we see a photograph of the asteroid Bennu, everyone knows how the photograph was obtained, and there is obvious evidence that it's a rock. A Bennu is a rock. But if you land on an artificial object, it will be as clear that it is artificial, because in principle we could read off the label "made on planet X," and we can even bring a sample of it, just like in the case of OSIRIS-REx, that will bring a sample back to Earth. In the case of a technology, it could have a huge financial benefit if it represents our future. It will be just like holding a cell phone that was not yet released to the public, that has lots of features that are quite exciting. We could bring that technology to Earth.
In the last segment, you said we could do experiments, and you said that you'd be happy to lead it. Could you talk about that a little bit? And it seems like you're inching towards explaining that what we can do to intercept. Is that where you're going with that? The experiment?
Well, so there are two things. One are objects that are far away, like Oumuamua, that pass within a fraction of the distance of the sun from Earth. And, it's a large distance, so you need to send a spacecraft in order to get close to them and examine them and take a photograph. So I call that space archaeology. Basically, we are trying to look for relics that were sent or left behind by technological civilization that might not be around anymore. These civilizations might be dead, but nevertheless, we can detect their equipment. And the way to identify that equipment is to intercept its trajectory, get a close-up look at it. So that's one aspect. And of course, yes, that's my hope that such an experiment will be funded. And then the second
And for that, do we need ground-based, giant specialized telescopes, or do we need to send spaceships, or whatever you want to call it, up to space to do that?
We have to send to space because any conceivable extension of the current telescopes will not make the telescope big enough to resolve an object the size of a football field across the distance to the sun. Okay, so that's too far away. But OSIRIS-REx demonstrated that we can not only take a close-up photograph, but actually land on an object of interest. So I would argue in favor of that approach. And that's a space mission, but it need not be too expensive. Depending on what the technology, what we put on board. In the case of OSIRIS-REx, we wanted it to scoop actually material from Bennu. But if you just want to pass by the object and take a photograph so that we can figure out whether it's artificial or natural, that may be less expensive. And then another approach should be taken towards the unidentified aerial phenomena, or UAP, that is being discussed in the upcoming report to Congress. And there we should just place cameras in those geographic locations or others, state-of-the-art cameras, obtain open data, use a wide field telescope perhaps to scan the sky, and see if any unusual objects show up, and then analyze the data scientifically. And I think it's the business of scientists to figure out what these objects are if they are not human-made, because we want to know scientifically what their nature is. And that is another kind of experimental work that I'm happy to lead or be engaged in, should the appropriate funding come either from the private sector or from the government. Either one, but it needs to be funded.
Professor Loeb, with respect to the first approach, this is to send something from Earth to get a closer look at these objects in space. Is there a possibility of using current satellites or space missions? I don't know, SpaceX, Mr. Bezos is going up to space, to sort of add on to what they're doing, or no, this would need a separate mission towards these objects?
Yeah, it would need a separate mission. I mean,
the
Europeans have a mission that could potentially intercept some asteroid if they come close enough. But what we need is to design a special mission that would target interstellar objects that originate from outside the solar system. We don't care about rocks that are orbiting inside the solar system. They are not of interest. We've seen a lot of them. We want to see objects that come from outside. And
by outside, I mean outside the solar system, right?
Outside the solar system, and look unusual in the sense that they do not share the qualities of either comets or asteroids. There is no cometary tail. And for example, they get pushed by reflecting sunlight. These are characteristics that would make them very special. And we want to focus on those. It's just like walking on the beach, and most of the time you see rocks that are naturally produced or
and just pass by.
And you don't, because you've seen a lot of these rocks. But every now and then you encounter a plastic bottle. And that is what we are looking for, because it indicates the existence of a civilization that produced it.
Professor Loeb, you mentioned upcoming report to Congress. I'd love to talk about that. So we'll be back after a short break to talk about UFOs, UAPs, and our government.
We hope you are enjoying this podcast. And if you are, then why not treat us to a cup of coffee? That's right. For the price of a cup of coffee, you too can become a monthly supporter of the Peel.News podcast. And it's easy. Just click the support link in the detailed caption of this episode. And while you're there, check out the information about our guests and attributions to our theme music. And thank you.
So, Professor Loeb, the Pentagon intelligence report on UFOs, UAPs is due to Congress this week. Before we get to that report, how do you think our government in the last 40, 50 years, whatever, has handled the subject of UFOs? Denial, secrecy, sort of real substantive research? Do politicians roll their eyes?
Yeah. So I think there are two ingredients that shaped the way that the government interacted with this subject. One is that a lot of the data that was related to unidentified objects was classified because it was obtained by sensors, instruments, probes that are classified. The government is in possession of instruments that monitor the sky for obvious reasons, for national security. I mean, you want to know if there is any object invading the airspace of the US because it could pose a threat to our country, and that makes a lot of sense. So there is a lot of sophisticated equipment that is monitoring the sky, and obviously you don't want to release the data in that case because it will provide adversaries with information about which equipment is being used to monitor the sky. Okay, and that is classified information. So the data is classified not because of the nature of the data, but more because of the way that it was obtained. Okay, that's why we often see rather unconvincing data that doesn't look as, to scientists sufficiently unusual. But I think that it's just the tip of the iceberg, that there is much more data that we don't have access to. And perhaps, different branches of the government do not, share all the data they have with each other because of that. Okay, so that's point number one. Point number two is there is this taboo on discussing the subject among scientists, as we discussed, and politicians make the calculation whether they want to discuss it, politicians or administrators within the government, and because they don't want to be ridiculed. They don't want people to say, "Oh, you're crazy that you even discussed this subject." And that was the prevailing.
I imagine that would happen, right? Go ahead, sir.
So that was the dominant or the prevailing intellectual atmosphere until recently, and as a result, you won't hear much discussion about it for these two reasons that I mentioned. And the nature of the discussion changed recently, and it's not exactly clear to me why. Maybe because enough data came out and was examined that indicates that it's not a matter of national security of other nations spying on the US, but something else, and that may have helped. Or that, the fact that I discussed openly Oumuamua also prepared the ground for a bigger discussion. I'm not sure what is exactly the reason, but there is definitely a change in the tone. And you find high-level officials like former President Barak Obama or former CIA directors Woolsey and Brennan talking about it as if, this is a serious matter and we should discuss it. And the report will also discuss it. And I think there is a change in the way the discussion goes now. And that's a very good change. However, the main change in the future needs to be that the subject is brought to the attention of scientists that will explore it scientifically and by collecting more data, more evidence, and clear up the fog. Why should we are in the 21st century? We shouldn't behave as if we are in the dark ages where people had convictions and believed in miracles and all kinds of strange things. Nowadays, we should examine if there are objects that we don't understand the nature of. We should just study it scientifically, just like we don't know the nature of dark matter, so we study it. What's the difference?
We talked about the report a couple of times. We mentioned it. What is this report that's supposed to be declassified and given to Congress? I think it's this week, actually, June 25th. And is it going to bring some conclusion, or is it just going to create more debates on the matter?
Well, we don't. I didn't have access to see the report as of yet, and once it's released, we will know more. But the report will also have a confidential component, a classified component that we will not see. And I think the way to gauge the significance of the report is by seeing serious people in Washington, D.C. discussing it as a serious matter, because those people that have access to the full data, to the classified information, would never appear to discuss it seriously if that data was flaky, as some scientists are suggesting. Some scientists say, oh yeah, you look at these fuzzy images, there is nothing there. But my point is there is a mountain of data that is hidden from us. And if people that had access to that data behave, and those are people you respect, behave as if it's a serious matter, we should explore it scientifically. It's sufficiently intriguing for us to clear up. And if it's a natural phenomenon, what's the big deal? Let's just collect more data and figure out what the reason is for these appearances that were claimed by military personnel. I mean, if we clear it up, then we move on. If it happens to be a natural phenomena or some artifact or whatever that is explained by a mundane origin, then let's just figure it out and move on.
Do you think that the recent videos that have come out showing sightings by Navy pilots, and I think one of them was on a 60-minute show recently, are there any different than past UFO sightings?
Well,
in quality and in dramatic nature of it, or anything?
I think the most important aspect of these reports is that they are not detected just by one instrument and by one person. That's extremely important, because if multiple people from different viewing angles see the same thing, it cannot be an illusion. I mean, it's something is happening. And then if you see the same thing with a radar system and with infrared detectors and with optical cameras, then, it's difficult to imagine that there would be the same fault in all. I mean, all of these instruments will malfunction in exactly the same way so as to give you the appearance of an object in the same location that looks the same way. And I think that is the key. And what we should look for in the report when it comes out is those events that have multiple sources of detection. Because if you have just one source of detection, if it's one person, for example, without any instruments whatsoever, then it can be subjective.
I see. So you have several different instruments corroborating one another.
Yes,
yes.
And that's extremely important. And showing the same, for example, movement of an object. And, as a scientist, if I had the opportunity to collect more data, I would look for the side effects that these motions imply. For example, if an object moves faster than the speed of sound, there must be a sonic boom in the air. I mean, just the way that the jet, when a jet moves faster than sound, there is a sonic boom, and it's unavoidable. A shock wave must be produced. So if we can detect this side effect, it lends credibility to the idea that there was a real object moving faster than sound in air, and so things like that, you can, if an object passes through water, there should be a splash. If you don't see these things, then it means that something, it's not a real object. Something else was identified as a moving point of light, but it's not really a real object, because there should be a sonic boom. There should be some splash of water. So these are the kind of things I would use to check if what we are looking at are real.
And in fact, Navy pilots have said that they've seen these objects accelerate at rates that would just not be possible with currently available technology.
Yeah.
And they refer to hypersonic. What is hypersonic, please?
Hypersonic is just faster than the speed of sound.
Okay. So it's faster than supersonic? Is that it?
No, it's the same thing.
It's the same thing. I see.
The same thing. I mean, in air, you have sound waves, like the waves we use to communicate. When I speak, I create a sound wave from my mouth. Basically, a disturbance in the density of air that moves at a certain speed. And that's how we speak to each other. It's sound waves. But if you have an object moving faster than sound, then it moves ahead of the sound that it produces.
Wow.
And then what you end up with is a shock wave. Basically, it ends up just like when you look at a ship moving through the surface of the ocean. If it moves very fast, you see sort of a cone behind it. And in the same way, you get a sharp discontinuity, a jump in the density of air across a shock wave, which is the sonic boom that you get. So that's why I was saying that, you can't have motion faster than sound without producing a shock wave. And therefore, as a physicist, when I look at some unusual motions, I would look for the side effects just to confirm the notion that these are real objects. And that's why I want to do this experiment, to collect more data about these objects. Because, the military personnel or the politicians, they don't have the background in physics that would allow them to evaluate or judge whether these, what are the consequences of these motions. And a scientist can do that.
Wonderful. Let's take a break here. Stay with me and Professor Loeb as we get into the perspective. Professor Loeb, we humans encroach into others' territories all the time. For example, we consistently develop our communities deep into the wilderness and then complain about bears and moose in our backyards. And more relevant still, we've done it to our other humans. Exploration of the Americas and Australia, where Europeans explorers collided with existing civilizations and subdued them. So do you think the proliferation of space exploration and travel, such as most recently planned by Mr. Bezos and his brother, will create a situation in which we encroach into the territory of others in civilizations in the universe? Or are we eons away from that?
Yeah, I don't think that we risk anything by moving into space, because space is very vast. The distance to the nearest star is such that it takes 4 years for light to travel that distance. So with our best spacecraft, the best chemical rockets we have, it will take us 50,000 years to reach the nearest star. And that's a long time. So even if Bezos or Elon Musk aspire to move away from the solar system, with current spacecraft, they will get to the nearest star, in 50,000 years, which is roughly the time that elapsed since the first humans left Africa. That we should have sent the spacecraft back. They should have sent it back then in order for it to arrive right now. So my point is, it takes a huge amount of time, and you have to be patient, and you cannot send humans or living creatures on those journeys because the environment is very hazardous and you're exposed to cosmic rays and conditions are harsh. So it makes much more sense to send equipment in the form of artificial intelligence and 3D printers, such equipment that will adapt to changing circumstances on its own because it has its own intelligence. And by the way, AI systems would supersede the abilities of human in the coming decade. I mean, it's pretty clear based on the development right now. And so you can imagine a machine learning that would allow intelligent computers to behave in a way that would adapt to changing circumstances, would make them completely autonomous. And if they are connected to 3D printers, they can duplicate themselves, reproduce more systems that look like them. And in principle, they would be able to travel large distances. So that's why I think that it's most likely that we will meet, in the first encounter, we will meet equipment rather than living creatures.
Which makes sense, because if it's going to take us $50,000 years to physically get to another star, it'll be the same probably for them, right?
Right. But they may have started 1 billion years ago, so they may have populated the galaxy. So my point is, don't worry about stepping on their toes, so to speak, because space is vast, and also it takes huge amount of time to travel the distance.
And I think you just answered the question that I think about from time to time when I see UFO shows and in preparation for our conversation. If UFOs are real, if there are other civilizations out there, and you seem to submit that it just makes sense that they are, do you think that sort of puts a time limit on humanity, on our civilization?
Yeah, well, I start from a point of view of modesty. I don't think that we are special or particularly interesting, but it's possible that probes came to visit us to see what is going on here. And if they had to give us a grade, I would argue that they shouldn't allow us into the club of galactic intelligent civilizations, because we haven't demonstrated yet much intelligence in our history. I mean, we are wasting.
In what sense?
We are wasting a lot of resources on fighting each other, on trying to feel superior relative to each other, and all of these things make very little sense in the big scheme of things. And I think an intelligent species is supposed to follow the guiding principles of science, which is cooperation and sharing of evidence-based knowledge. And even within the scientific community right now, a lot of the knowledge is not following evidence. It's just a matter of a sociological consensus or herd groupthink. So people, when they see anomalies, they don't say, "Oh, that's weird. Let's examine these anomalies. Maybe it will shake our prejudice. Maybe we will find something new." That's the way that kids would approach learning about the world. They would be open-minded and check everything. But the scientific community is very much entrenched in past notions, and I don't find that as the most intelligent thing to do. I think evidence-based knowledge is the key for our future.
From what I'm hearing from you is that curiosity is not the sort of the thrusting point for the scientific community when it comes to
Well,
UFOs. There's so much prejudice and also funding issues, right?
Well, because there is a risk involved. If it happens not to be extraterrestrial in origin, then you might risk your image. You might go in the wrong direction. But my point is, we went in the wrong direction in the case of dark matter, for example. It didn't bother anyone that we tried to find the types of dark matter that were not real, why should we limit our curiosity in the context of searching for things like us that exist on planets that are similar to Earth? Why not search for those others out there? And I think if we limit our curiosity because we have a prejudice, we will never discover wonderful things unless we are ready to find them. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you're not searching, you will never find these things.
Of course. Professor Loeb, any last imparting lessons to Americans, to ordinary Americans, not to the government or the scientific community when it comes to UFOs?
Yeah, so in my book, I wrote my book primarily to the young generation with the hope that when the younger people occupy the halls of academia in the future, they will bring a fresh perspective on this subject. And I very much hope that it will become mainstream and that we will find the answer in our lifetime, whether we are the smartest kid on the block. And it would be very exciting if we are not.
Exciting in what sense if we're not?
Because we can, for example, if we find a piece of equipment that is from our future, a million years from now, we might be able to develop it ourselves. By copying it, we will get a quantum jump into our future. We will save a million years in our own development. And even though it would feel as if we're cheating in an exam, like we're getting the answer from the student next to us without, trying to find it ourselves. If there is no teacher that overlooks, over our shoulders and gives us a grade, I would much rather save a million years in the process.
You're 100% correct. In fact, as a former patent attorney, I can tell you many inventions are built on top of previous inventions. Previous technological advances give aspirations for new technological advances. So that the same thing could happen with finding information from out of this world.
Yeah, I seek intelligence in space because I don't often find it here on Earth, and it would give us inspiration. I completely agree.
It would. Well, Professor Loeb, thank you so much for educating me and our listeners. You're welcome back to the Peel.News anytime. And to our listeners, if you know of any history that could provide more perspective from the past on this subject, please share it with us and tell us what's your perspective. The opinions and statements of our guests are their own. We neither agree nor disagree with them. We're only interested in the perspective they provide through history. At the Peel.News, we're honored that our guests share their expertise with us, most of which are based on years of scholarship and research. And we provide links to their projects and publications for your benefit, to review them if you wish. Otherwise, we're not affiliated with our guests. We just think they teach us pretty cool history, the history behind our news. Also, unless we explicitly inform you, we're not affiliated with any institutions, including Amazon, for which book links are shared here from time to time for your convenience. Finally, as a reminder, we don't do news here at the Peel.News. We peel the news for the history behind it. And our mission is not to provide a complete account and analysis of the past, rather is to highlight some issues and incidents in our history that may poke and prod your discerning minds into seeking some perspective for our current events. And if you disagree with our take, on history? Well then, it means we've succeeded in getting you to think about the history behind news. And of course, share your thoughts with me by leaving comments about this episode on our Instagram page at thepeel.news. I love to hear from you. I love to learn from you. Until next time, this is Adele with appeal.news.